Hi everyone, and welcome to the next character video on Wrestling with RahXephon. At this point in our retrospective, we're starting to get into characters who are not necessarily the most relevant or best characterized, and we're starting to slide into more problematic characters. Now when I say problematic, I don't necessarily mean horrible or offensive. I simply mean to say that these are characters who struggle to be both well developed and defined, and also relevant to the plot. They tend to choose one or the other, and the overall story and characterization suffers for that. Oh, and for future reference, I don't necessarily consider Ayato to fall into this, but seeing that he is the main protagonist, he is going to get his own video at the very end of the character section anyways. Easing into this odd section of the retrospective, we're going to start with everyone's favorite, or at least my favorite, weirdo supporting character, and that is Futagami. Now, Joji Futagami is introduced as a sort of news reporter, and he kind of just does his own thing throughout the entirety of the story. It's really kind of weird as he kind of exists in a vacuum, and that's really the most fascinating thing about his character. However, while this is an odd thing about his character, and his character kind of just exists to kind of fix the plot, or at least keep it together, which is a sign of a weak narrative, I still love his character. As even if he is essentially just a band-aid for RahXephon's weird lackluster storytelling or bizarre attempts at foreshadowing, he's a very memorable band-aid and one with a lot of personality. In fact, this guy is basically anime Columbo, and as such, he's a very weird character to look at from a structural point of view, because he doesn't really fit into the story at all. He basically just serves as an exposition dump, and he just exists in a vacuum, sort of. He never really interacts with the cast unless it's to do some exposition, and yet he feels immensely more personable, likable, warm, realistic, and integrated to the story, or at least to me, than a lot of the other members of the cast, which we're probably supposed to relate to more, and are probably supposed to have more character development. And I think that's why I give this guy a pass, because I don't know any other exposition character, not even in RahXephon, but in general, that is just so likable and pleasant, and gets away with having little actual character development. He feels like a real person, and realistically, he's probably the only guy asking and answering questions that a lot of us as viewers have, and as such is ultimately a sort of proxy for the viewer, and this even helps him survive being in a vacuum, as, yeah, he doesn't really do anything, but he's our source of information, our eyes, if you will. So as viewers, we grow to like him, or at least I really did. He's kind of even a secondary protagonist in this way, as he figures out what the show is alongside with us. But before we get to that point, we have to briefly ask, does he actually do anything plot relevant? And this is where his character kind of falls on the problematic side, as he does do one really plot relevant thing, but for the most part, he just kind of expositions. Now, Futagami is introduced around episode 8, and he's simply portrayed as a curious news reporter who seems to be pretty sharp. He's chosen by the director to be the media representative for Terra, and this basically means that Anime Columbo gets a guided tour of RahXephon and is basically allowed to go wherever he wants and interview whoever, and gather information for himself, and then share information or just interviews with various members of the cast at various points throughout the story. It's through these conversations, though, that Futagami really shines, as he asks and answers a lot of questions that we the viewers would have, and even gives out some good life advice. This is how he expositions certain plot points and basically keeps the story together, as it likes to do a lot of foreshadowing and isn't necessarily the biggest fan of linear storytelling. Big reveals reviewed by Futagami include Kusanagi's past, Kwan being a Mu, Ayato's adoptive mother of Maya being a Mu leader, Lord Bobbin being immortal, and many other weird things that we probably wouldn't know if Futagami didn't tell us, or at least it would have been a lot harder to figure out. Again, this guy kind of holds the plot together. Anyways, these scattered conversations and revelations are almost the entirety of what he does, until about episode 20, where Futagami is revealed to be an intelligence officer and manages to track down Ayato after he recently returns from Tokyo Jupiter. He helps Ayato kind of gather his thoughts, gather himself as he leaves the bloodstained apartment that he accidentally killed Asahina in, although he in turn gets captured by Foundation agents. Although this always confused me, as As by this point in the story, I'm assuming that both the Foundation and Terrace are still kind of on the same page and kind of want the same things to happen. So I don't know why they're pointing guns at Ayato and the guy who probably plans on bringing him back to Terra Command anyways. Like, why are they pointing guns at each other? This is kind of weird, but that's besides the point. Anyways, this act of capturing Ayato is the first plot-relevant thing that Futagami does that is not exposition-related or telling something of mild importance to another character or the viewers. And this also hints that he may be something more than a simple reporter, which is confirmed a few episodes later when he returns as a Terra intelligence officer, whose real name is actually Takeshi Jumanji. Although, for the sake of this video, I will continue to call him Futagami and anime Columbo, or just Columbo. In spite of this big reveal though, he basically just goes back to being anime Columbo, goes back to being exposition man, and he does a few more expositions, a few more talks, and his last one, with Lord Bobbin, ultimately concludes with him shooting Lord Bobbin, although due to the reset, I don't know how impactful this is, and I hope he's doing good somewhere, as this guy is really likable, even if he doesn't actually do anything. All of this sets up Futagami as probably my second favorite character in the series, both because of how interesting he is as a character, and how well characterized he is, and just how helpful he is to the viewer, like in a meta sense. This guy, again, kind of holds the series together. He is the glue that is keeping us pasted to the series. I love the whole anime Columbo angle, and he wears it really good, and he's just a cool guy overall. For those unfamiliar with Columbo, just imagine a guy who's a lot smarter than he seems, and gets directly to the point in the most roundabout way possible. And that's basically both of these guys in a nutshell. Futagami may not really have an arc or really much growth or character development, but again, he gets a pass here because his baseline, his floor, is high enough to succeed here. It's pretty obvious that he already has had some development or life experiences, and he does seem to be an older member of the cast, so I'm going to assume this guy's been around the block a few times, and we just didn't get to see it. Although we can infer some of this just from how calm he is under pressure and just how he handles himself, and some of the advice he gives, which seems pretty wise. He may look like an oaf, but he's really not, and he's actually pretty smart and self-aware. All of this personality helps Columbo feel like one of the most human members of the entire cast, which is good because, you know, he's really likable, but it is also kind of a red flag, seeing as that this guy is here solely for exposition. He should not be in the top 5 most likable characters. But how much of an issue that is, I'll leave up to you to decide. I bring this up though because RahXephon does struggle a lot with making likable / relatable / interesting characters, so it's odd to me that for some reason, one of the characters that is the most of these is just the exposition guy. Like, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me that the exposition guy is more likable to me than like 80% of the cast. I don't dislike a majority of the cast, it's just that this guy has so much personality, you can't help but love him. And this doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but in this case I'm not complaining. And it does allow Columbo to get away with facilitating some bad storytelling on the part of RahXephon. You see, one of the cardinal rules of storytelling, at least when it comes to like movie or TV storytelling, is you always want to show and you don't want to tell. Because if you just tell the viewer something, they might tune it out, it might not be as interesting, it's kind of boring honestly, and there's no real, it's not as convincing because you're just telling someone something. They didn't actually see it happen, and they don't actually know what it looked like or a lot of the facts of how it went down. For this reason, when you tell a story, especially in the visual medium like television or movies, it's always better to show and not tell. And RahXephon as a whole struggles with this and often commits the grave sin of telling and not showing. None of this is to say that RahXephon never shows anything either, and that everything is spoon-fed to us via Futagami. RahXephon does do a lot of quote-unquote showing. I just think that it should be noted though that a lot of it isn't as effective as it could be due to the very frantic and odd nature of the editing, as a lot of scenes that would be used to show us things, scenes like epiphanies or scenes like flashbacks or scenes of that nature, are often spliced in between other more hectic scenes, and so they just kind of feel out of place and create a kind of odd tonal whiplash. RahXephon loves to do this thing where it'll take like a 3-minute action scene and like a 3-minute epiphany scene and kind of cut them into little bits and then mix all those bits together, so we just keep cutting between 15 seconds of action, 20 seconds of epiphany, 35 seconds of action, 22 seconds of finding my inner soul, And doing so kind of dilutes both, as while I understand they're trying to create tension by showing a metaphysical kind of struggle mirrored against a physical kind of struggle, doing so rapidly doesn't give either scene enough time to really land and impact us as viewers. Take this scene. Kwan is in a hallway. She's discovering herself. She's beginning to awaken and come into contact with her inner soul. She doesn't know what that looks like though, and thus she sees it as Mishima, who simply tells her that the time will come and to wait and embrace who she is, basically. Now, in a vacuum, that scene sounds fine. However, as noted earlier, this is kind of spliced between two bigger scenes that aren't really related, so it feels out of place in general, and this is made even worse by the fact that there's no real context here. RahXephon also likes to deprive the viewer of context, which I understand is done to create mystery. However, doing that 100% of the time just kind of makes it feel like the writers didn't even really know what was happening. Now, I'm not saying that's true. They did obviously want to establish Kwan awakening, and they wanted to keep that mysterious. However, the lack of context does create some disconnect between us as viewers and RahXephon as a story. All of this is to say that due to RahXephon's editing and lack of context, really, a lot of the scenes showing us stuff are not as effective as they could be, and kind of come off at worst as misplaced and even incoherent at times. And there's a lot of examples of showing like this throughout the series which are kind of botched. Again, I'm not saying the series has to explicitly state everything and spoon-feed the audience. That is insulting to the audience's attention. However, some scenes do need context, and you literally can't just expect every scene to flow well when it's cut up into pieces and spliced in with some other completely unrelated scene. RahXephon's editing goes too far in too many places, and there needs to be some through line that isn't quite present here. And all of this is kind of why I understand and accept why Futagami exists, as even if he does exist solely to tell us things, it seems like the writers consciously made the decision to do so in order to kind of patch up the fact that a lot of the quote showing scenes are not as good as they could be. It seems like there was a conscious recognition of the fact that just watching the series the first time can be quite confusing due to the editing and lack of context, and Futagami was kind of put in to prop that up. And Columbo is kind of one of the biggest factors here. Again, he gets a pass because it's kind of necessary with how fast the plot moves, but it is something that we should note. I mean, the fact that a lot of this is done via Futagami is probably one of the only reasons it's somewhat palatable. In fact, in this way, he kind of saves the series as one of the only characters who even tries to answer some of the questions that we as viewers may have, and this prevents viewers from simply giving up on the series, which is a very valuable service from a meta standpoint. Again, plot-wise and in-universe, this guy does basically nothing, but in a meta sense, this guy does a lot. He carries the show in some ways, really. And this solidifies Columbo's role as the band-aid, barely holding together a lot of the collective plot strings here. He is essential for this reason, even if he doesn't do anything in the actual story, and so much so that doing so consumes almost his entire character and all of his time on screen. I cannot stress how bizarre it is that there's a character with a good amount of screen time that exists solely for the plot, and not even to move it, but to solely inform the viewer of its weird intricacies and details. This is the guy that explains so many of the things that honestly sound too weird or dumb for me to believe if I wasn't specifically shown, which RahXephon can't do due to its bizarre pacing and just the fact there's too many directions for it to go to, or explicitly told. And this explains why he also kind of exists in a vacuum and doesn't really do anything else. He was created solely to tell the audience things, and not even really to tell the cast things. I mean, he does, but I feel like that's done more so the audience can listen into these conversations and figure out stuff for themselves. It's one step above him just looking at the camera and saying, oh, by the way, Kunigi accidentally killed his daughter, and so on and so forth. He does have his own character, but he doesn't really grow as a character, and we don't really explore who he is as a person. He just happens to be an exposition guy who has a lot of charm to his name. And in this way, Futagami is kind of a manifestation of RahXephon's bad storytelling and its writing flaws as a whole, as the story is so poorly told in conventional ways that an entire character was created solely to rectify this. And in doing so, the entirety of his character is consumed by this, and he's not really a character that has an assigned arc or development or even that much screen time dedicated to anything other than exposition. I love his style, I love his vibe, I love that he's anime Columbo, but if they hadn't nailed those surface elements, or if we dig a little deeper under them, we can see that there's really not that much to this guy, and his own personal development and arc and character is actually kind of limited beyond that surface level. It is very fortunate though that it is a very good surface level, and again that makes his job of basically keeping the audience in the loop acceptable to me, as again he's a very likable character even if he's not super complex. He feels like he would be, and he feels like he would make a great protagonist of his own show, but unfortunately that's not what RahXephon does with him, and he's just the exposition guy here. It is very fortunate though he's very charismatic and that he's very good at his job of telling the audience things, as it does give him a lot of wiggle room to be the best Band-Aid of all time in the realm of storytelling, as it does give him the wiggle room to kind of just exposition his way through everything and keep the audience in the loop. And that, as well as being anime Columbo, gives him enough wiggle room to get away with simply being around to exposition.